Today we're continuing with the Epic History TV's Napoleonic War series, and we're finally here, one of the biggest battles in European history prior to the First World War, and it's the Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations in 1813. If you want to join the community, just hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. If you're a history buff, if you love history, we all love history here. As always, I'm gonna give my thoughts, opinions, additional information. If you have something interesting to say or to correct me, please let me know in the comment section below. Okay, this one is a long one, 33 minutes. But I can understand it because it's one of the most important battles in European history.
October 1813. Napoleon Bonaparte faced his greatest crisis since becoming Emperor of the French 9 years before. His long war in Spain had ended in defeat, and an Anglo-Spanish-Portuguese army had now crossed the Pyrenees to invade France itself.
Yeah, the long guerrilla warfare.
Germany, the Kingdom of Bavaria had switched sides and joined the Sixth Coalition against France. While in Saxony, Napoleon faced 4 armies converging on him from all directions. What's more, these were not the same bunglers he'd crushed in 1805 and 6 at Austerlitz and Jena. Prussia, Austria and Russia had all learned from their mistakes. They were now better organized, trained and led, and more wary of Napoleon. The largest coalition force was the Army of Bohemia, commanded by Austrian Field Marshal the Prince of Schwarzenberg. His was a huge mixed Austrian-Russian-Prussian army of 194,000 men and 790 guns. To the north, Blücher's Army of Silesia and the Army of the North under Napoleon's ex-Marshal Bernadotte, now Crown Prince of Sweden. Together 130,000 men and 536 guns.
Bernadotte the traitor.
General Bennigsen's Army of Poland, besieging Dresden. Another 34,000 men and 135 guns. In total, the coalition had fielded 360,000 men and 1,500 guns, with Russia supplying the bulk of the troops. One unique addition to Bernadotte's Army of the North was a single troop of British rocket artillery, an experimental weapon system based on the Congreve rocket, a type seen here in 1830. Although wildly inaccurate, their high-explosive warhead could be devastating at close range.
Cool, but I never heard about that.
Napoleon's forces around Leipzig were outnumbered almost 2 to 1. But with 200,000 men and 700 guns, the Grande Armée was still a force to be reckoned with many experienced troops and commanders, even though it increasingly relied on young conscripts to make up numbers. There were another 140,000 men that Napoleon could not call on.
Yeah, the left ones in Poland,
General
in
Rapp's
Prussia.
10th Corps besieged in Danzig, Marshal Saint-Cyr's 1st Corps besieged in Dresden, Marshal Davout's 13th Corps holding Hamburg, as well as several smaller besieged garrisons across Germany and Poland. Napoleon was currently about 20 miles north of Leipzig with the bulk of his army. Marshal Murat was 40 miles to the south with 90,000 men, covering Schwarzenberg. Napoleon now decided to rapidly join Murat, and with their temporary superiority in numbers, defeat Schwarzenberg, before Bernadotte and Blücher could intervene. Murat had orders to conduct a fighting withdrawal northwards. But at Liebert-Volkwitz, he was drawn into major combat with the enemy's advance guard. Around 12,000 horsemen fought what some have described as the largest cavalry battle in Europe's history. Murat, in the thick of it as usual, was very nearly captured by Prussian dragoons. The battle ended in a minor coalition victory, with around 2,000 casualties on each side. The next day, Napoleon arrived to take command. This video is sponsored by the Great Courses Plus.
There's so much to talk about. Okay, so France has lost the guerrilla war in Spain. Their main territory of France could be invaded. The second thing is he lost almost all of his experienced troops in Russia. Third thing is the German lands are going to turn against him. And the German lands are buffer zone between him, Prussia, Austria, and Russia. The coalition forces adopted all the tactics that he used. They adapted a tactic where they would avoid Napoleon and his main army and instead attack his marshals. All the soldiers that Napoleon gained were young conscripts, teenagers. They were quite inexperienced, and he starts to lose the home front. So a lot of the French politicians back in France want, like either to oust him or to give up his powers, to negotiate a peace treaty. And if we look at it as a war of attrition, the coalition powers have more to throw at Napoleon. So he is the one who needs to count on every soldier, where he's moving, all his losses, and so on. And the Allies can just bombard him with troops and cannons and artillery and so on, because they had more supplies than him at this point of time.
By the 16th of October, Napoleon had concentrated most of his forces south of Leipzig. Field Marshal Schwarzenberg, meanwhile, against Russian advice, had deployed his army on either side of the Pleiße River, which would hinder his movements throughout the battle. Napoleon had entrusted the northern sector to Marshal Ney, with orders to keep an eye out for Blücher and Bernadotte. But Napoleon didn't expect them for at least another day, and so Ney had orders to transfer most of his troops south for the attack on Schwarzenberg. Schwarzenberg, however, knew that Blücher and Bernadotte were closer than Napoleon suspected, and that Bennigsen was also marching up from Dresden. This was the moment the coalition had been waiting for. All their armies converging on Napoleon, with overwhelming superiority in numbers.
Definitely a checkmate.
However, the coalition's headquarters were nothing like Napoleon's, where one man's will decided all. Schwarzenberg had to attempt to coordinate the actions of 3 large armies from 3 separate states. And although he was commander-in-chief, his plans still needed to be approved by Emperor Alexander, the supreme commander, whilst he also managed relations with the King of Prussia and the Emperor of Austria, all of whom were present at his headquarters. The plan finally agreed was for General Wittgenstein's corps group to lead an attack in 4 main columns, with 2 Austrian flanking attacks west of the Pleiße.
So they tried to encircle him to cut off his retreat.
The bombardment began along the line, as Russian, Austrian and Prussian infantry regiments advanced across cold, muddy fields. Wachau soon fell to Russian infantry, but French artillery fire made it impossible for them to advance further. Victor's Second Corps then counterattacked, retaking the village at bayonet point.
The Russians are really providing the bulk of the army. The meat of the army.
Wachau would change hands twice more that morning. These bloody contests for small Saxon villages would come to typify the fighting around Leipzig. At Markkleeberg, Kleist's Prussian Second Corps drove out the Polish defenders after bitter fighting, while on the left bank of the Pleiße, Merveldt's Austrian Second Corps struggled across broken ground to attack well-defended villages. Their assault on Konnewitz stalled, but with heavy losses, the Austrians got a toehold in Dörlitz. On the right flank, around 10 a.m, Klenau's 4th Corps occupied the high ground of the Kolmberg and fought its way into Liebert-Wolkwitz. Napoleon, observing from Gallows Hill, ordered up Augereau's 9th Corps and the Young Guard in support. MacDonald's 11th Corps was now also arriving in position on his left. His troops retook the Kolmberg and counterattacked Liebert-Wolkwitz, driving out the Austrians and pursuing them over the fields beyond. The advance was only halted when Russian Cossacks were sighted on their open left flank.
Of course, Russian
Bennigsen's
Cossacks!
army was not far off. The coalition offensive was going nowhere, with most of its modest gains lost to French counterattacks. But there was one sector where the coalition had more success that morning. General Goulay's Austrian 3rd Corps, with orders to threaten Napoleon's line of retreat, advanced over marshy ground towards Lindenau. Ney had to divert Bertrand's 4th Corps to reinforce the village and ensure the road to France was kept open. Napoleon was waiting for Ney's reinforcements before launching his attack on Schwarzenberg, but now 4th Corps was tied down at Lindenau, and there was more bad news from Ney. Blücher's army of Silesia was approaching from the northwest. Marmont's 6th Corps had to turn about to keep the Prussians at bay. Heavy fighting broke out around Möckern, the village itself held by elite French Marines, while Dąbrowski's Polish division clung on to Wiedrich under attack from an entire Russian corps. This was a nasty surprise for Napoleon, who'd thought Blücher was still a day's march away. But the old Prussian general, hearing cannon fire to the south, had urged his men on and into the attack. Blücher intended to draw as many French troops onto himself as possible to assist Schwarzenberg's army of Bohemia. His actions and the bloody fight for Möckern may just have saved the coalition from defeat.
But it was impossible. They outnumbered him pretty hard. They outnumbered him. It was, I think that he, I mean, if we would put in so much ifs and buts, I think that then
Napoleon
we could say that he could have won,
the
but
whole
nah,
battlefield.
I don't think so.
But in the south he still had a numerical advantage, not as large as he'd hoped, nor likely to last long. Schwarzenberg and Alexander were already moving up reserves, though Schwarzenberg now found that his were on the wrong side of the Pleiße River, costing precious hours. It was now or never for Napoleon. At 2 p.m, he ordered the attack to begin. A grand battery of 180 guns blasted the enemy lines.
The Russians.
Then Victor's 2nd Corps, Lauriston's 5th Corps, and the Young Guard began their advance. In support, Murat gathered 2 entire cavalry corps, 10,000 horsemen, and led them in one of the great mass cavalry charges of the Napoleonic Wars. Cuirassiers of the 1st Heavy Cavalry Division broke through to the main enemy battery. Some even nearly reached the 3 coalition monarchs. But the ground was marshy and broken by fences and ditches. The French horses were soon exhausted and the squadrons disordered. Austrian cuirassiers and Russian Guard cavalry were coming up from the south. When these fresh Allied cavalry reserves charged the French, a great melee ensued. but the French were eventually driven back to their start line. Maison's division of the 5th Corps was involved in a desperate struggle for Geldengossa. The fighting swept back and forth through the village, the streets filling with dead and wounded from both sides. But as Russian and Prussian Guard regiments arrived to reinforce the village, the French were forced to fall back. Around 4 p.m, the Austrian Reserve Corps finally arrived and renewed the assault on Markkleeberg, one of the morning's objectives, which was finally secured. By 5 p.m, it was clear that Napoleon didn't have enough reserves to force a decisive outcome in the south. To the north, Meukern was being stubbornly held by French Marines with lethal close-range artillery support. But despite terrible losses, York's Prussian Corps continued to attack.
And
Marshal
those are all
Marmont
fresh
himself
troops.
Was wounded twice, but remained in command. Finally, a brilliant charge by Prussian hussars triggered a French rout. Meukern fell as Marmont's corps streamed back towards Leipzig. As dusk fell around 6 p.m, fighting died out across the battlefield. The first day of the battle had cost the French an estimated 25,000 casualties. The coalition at least 30,000.
Yeah, but they had more men
close,
to
but
throw
failed
at the
to
enemy.
land a decisive blow. The chance for victory was slipping from his grasp.
Ooh.
Sunday the 17th of October brought a lull, with both armies exhausted by the previous day's fighting. Napoleon needed to rest his troops and resupply them with ammunition, which was running dangerously low. He also sent a message to his father-in-law, Emperor Francis I, suggesting an armistice and finally offering concessions. But the Allies were no longer interested.
Yeah,
They knew time
it was too
on their
late at that
side.
point.
Yeah.
But later on, they will try to give him also concessions, and then he's going to reject them. But
The only major combat that day occurred in the north, where Blücher continued to attack. Russian infantry stormed Eutrich and Gorlice. Russian hussars charged and routed part of Arrighi's 3rd Cavalry Corps. That day, Napoleon received 14,000 reinforcements when Reynier's French Saxon 7th Corps arrived from the northeast. But the same day, the coalition received more than 100,000 reinforcements, as their armies continued to converge on Leipzig. Colloredo's Austrian 1st Corps, Bennigsen's Army of Poland, and Bernadotte's Army of the North, though the latter was widely
impossible.
criticized for his leisurely march to the battlefield. The next day, Napoleon would face odds of nearly 2 to 1. It was time for the Emperor to begin planning his retreat.
yeah, and the only route he has is through Leipzig and then go back. That's why the Austrians try to block his escape. But I think that those were too few forces to hold it if he tries to go back. So maybe they should have had more
On
troops
Monday
there.
morning, the sun shone across
On this
40
part.
square miles of battlefield, on which nearly 500,000 troops and 2,000 cannon were assembled. Soldiers from France, Germany, Russia, Austria, Poland, Italy, Sweden, the Netherlands, and even Britain. This
Croatia
was
and every
truly
other
the
small
battle of
nation.
the nations.
Czechs, Poles,
In preparation
Croats.
for his withdrawal, Napoleon pulled back his forces into a tighter defensive perimeter. and ordered Bertrand's 4th Corps to march west to secure the army's line of retreat. 2 divisions of the Young Guard under Marshal Mortier took their place at Lindenau. Schwarzenberg, meanwhile, planned to close the net on Napoleon with 6 converging attacks. Fighting in the south began around 8 AM. The Austrians took Dörlitz, but Marshal Oudinot led a counterattack at the head of a Young Guard division and drove them out again. Schwarzenberg was so alarmed by this reverse that he sent orders to recall Goulay's 3rd Corps. General Barclay's troops initially faced little opposition as they took Wachau and Liebert-Volkwitz, scenes of such bitter fighting 2 days before, but now scarcely defended. Barclay then paused, waiting for Bennigsen to get into position on his right before continuing his attack. Bennigsen's troops had more ground to cover, but towards noon they'd driven back MacDonald's infantry and taken their objectives. They would now wait for Bernadotte's army to link up on their right, but the Army of the North was again making slow progress, for which many again blamed its commander, who seemed exceedingly cautious about facing his old master in battle.
Because he knows what
Blucher,
Napoleon can do.
did not hesitate to launch Russian infantry against Leipzig's northern defences, though their attack failed with heavy losses. By 2 PM, Napoleon was hard-pressed on all fronts, but holding his own. His attention was now focused on Probstheide, key to his southern front, under attack from Kleist's Prussian 2nd Corps. French troops had turned the village into a fortress and inflicted terrible losses on the advancing Prussians. Probstheide was soon engulfed in smoke and fire as fighting raged on all sides. Some Prussian regiments lost half their men attacking the village, while 3 French generals were killed as they organized its defense. Napoleon even sent in Friant's division of the Guard to reinforce the position.
This is like the Battle of Stalingrad. Fighting for every village,
north,
for every corner, for every
was finally
house in the village.
Battle in earnest. Marmont had assembled 137 guns around Schönefeld, which poured fire into the Russian ranks. In response, Bernadotte massed 200 guns of his own. The fields were soon strewn with the dead and wounded, as the sheer weight of fire made it impossible for either side to advance. Around 3 PM, von Bülow's Prussian Corps, supported by Austrian Jaegers and its small British rocket detachment, attacked Paunsdorf. Reynier's 7th Corps could not withstand the onslaught.
And the French troops were already exhausted.
Saxon soldiers rushed over to the enemy and surrendered. The Saxons were deeply disillusioned with their French allies. Their main wish now was for a quick end to a war that had ravaged their homeland for many months. The hole in the line created by the Saxons' defection was soon plugged by Guard cavalry. But the coalition juggernaut could not be stopped. Towards dusk, under relentless Russian pressure, Marmont abandoned the burning ruins of Schönefeld, while the Prussians took Sellerhausen. In the south, Probstheide still held, but the situation was grim for Napoleon. The 3rd day's fighting cost both sides another 25,000 casualties. Napoleon's army was exhausted, outnumbered, virtually encircled, and critically low on ammunition. Finally, the Emperor gave the order to retreat.
Bro. I mean, now you know why it's called the Battle of the Nations, because... And it was one of the biggest battles in European history, so... At that point of time. But... Yeah,
Overnight,
look up...
under cover of darkness and...
Look up the monument. It's called the Völkerschlachtdenkmal. And there are, of course, a lot of monuments surrounding Leipzig and in Leipzig. Maybe I should go there and make a video there about the battle.
Early morning fog, the French army withdrew behind Leipzig's walls, and at 4 a.m. began its retreat west, crossing the single bridge over the Elster River that led back to France. There'd been time and materials to build extra bridges, but in what would prove a serious oversight, no one had given the necessary orders. Furthermore, there was no clear plan for Leipzig's defence, which was left to a jumble of under-strength units, mostly Poles and Germans. Napoleon left Leipzig around 10 a.m. Behind him there were scenes of mounting chaos and confusion, the city's streets jammed with troops, guns and wagons. The 20,000 wounded troops in the city had little hope of escape.
Yeah, and there's no way to get him out.
30 minutes later, shells began to rain on the city as the coalition launched an all-out assault from north, east and south. The rearguard held the city's gates for as long as they could, but they were soon overwhelmed by the enemy, and savage street fighting broke out across the city. A barge packed with gunpowder had been moored beneath the Elster Bridge so that it could be quickly destroyed after the rearguard crossed. Around 2 p.m, a corporal lit the fuse when he saw Russian soldiers on the far bank, even though the bridge was still packed with troops, wagons and horses.
Oh my god.
The bridge was destroyed in a gigantic explosion that trapped 30,000 men and 30 generals on the wrong side of the river. Panic broke out among those who suddenly found themselves cut off. Most became prisoners, but some tried to swim for it, including the Polish Prince Poniatowski, made a marshal by Napoleon just 3 days before.
They left Poniatowski
Weak from his
back.
wounds, he rode his horse into the river, but as it tried to climb the steep far bank, it rolled over him, and he was drowned.
They even left the prince
Marshal
behind.
MacDonald had also been cut off by the blast, and resolved to escape or die trying. He found a place where engineers had cut down 2 trees as a makeshift bridge, and made his attempt. And there I was, 1 foot on either trunk and the abyss below me. A high wind was blowing. I was wearing a large cloak, and fearing that someone would grab at it, I got rid of it. I was already 3/4 of the way across when some men decided to follow me. Their unsteady feet caused the trunks to shake, and I fell into the water. Fortunately, I could touch the bottom, but the bank was steep, the soil loose and slippery. Some of the enemy's skirmishers came up. They fired at me point blank and missed me, and some of our men who happened to be nearby drove them off and helped me out. I was wet from head to foot, breathless and sweating heavily from my efforts. Marshal Marmont, who had got across early in the day, gave me a horse. I wanted dry clothes more, but they were not to be had. The loss of the bridge turned what was already a heavy defeat for Napoleon into a disastrous one. Later that day, the 3 Allied monarchs met in the centre of Leipzig to celebrate their great victory. It had come at enormous cost. Exact numbers are impossible to establish, but in 4 days' fighting, the coalition armies suffered at least 52,000 casualties. Napoleon, who could less afford such losses, came off worse. 47,000 killed and wounded, 35,000 taken prisoner, 325 guns lost. More men were killed and wounded at Leipzig than in any European battle before the First World War. Sir George
And it
Jackson,
was once
British
again a
ambassador
big
to
hit on
Austria,
his home
rode over
front.
the battlefield with Metternich, the Austrian foreign minister, 2 days later. "A more revolting and sickening spectacle I never beheld," he wrote. "Scarcely could we move forward a step without passing over the dead body of some poor fellow, gashed with wounds and clotted with blood, another perhaps without an arm or a leg, here and there a headless trunk, or a head only, which caused our horses to stumble or start aside. It made one's blood run cold to glance upon the upturned faces of the dead. We got over this field of glory as quickly as we could."
Yeah. Now the rest of the German states are going
Napoleon
to
had
shift
suffered a
their
calamitous
allegiance to the coalition.
He had lost the battle for Germany. His domination of Europe appeared at an end. With 80,000 survivors, he began a fighting retreat to the French border. There was now no chance of rescue for the 100,000 men trapped in garrisons across Germany and Poland, though some would hold out for another 5 months. Marshal Murat took his leave of the Emperor, assuring him of his loyalty, but secretly planning to cut a deal with the Allies to save his throne in Naples. It was the last time the two men saw each other. 11 days after the Battle of Leipzig, Napoleon's former allies, the Bavarians, tried to block his escape at Hanau with 40,000 men. The Bavarian commander, von Wrede, had served with Napoleon in many campaigns. But on seeing his deployment for battle, Napoleon remarked, "I made him a count, but I couldn't make him a general." The French Emperor then ordered the Imperial Guard to lead an attack that forced the enemy to fall back in disarray. The French army reached the safety of Mainz 3 days later. Napoleon himself pushed on to Paris to contain the political damage from his defeat. Behind him, his empire was being dismantled. On the 4th of November, the coalition announced the dissolution of the Confederation of the Rhine, several of its former members now joining the war against France.
He lost
in the
the
Illyrian
buffer zone.
provinces, local revolts, Austrian invasion, and British naval support brought an end to French rule. In North Italy, Eugene was retreating steadily before the advance of von Hiller's Austrian army. While in Hamburg, Marshal Davout, with 34,000 troops, would soon be cut off and under siege. Napoleon's situation was desperate. But in the next campaign, fought for France itself.
Ich bin Benze, ich bin 24 Jahre alt und ich arbeite bei McDonald's.
Benze.
Ich habe immer schon gesehen,
Also ein Ungar, wahrscheinlich. In Hungarian, oh my god, I was talking in German.
Master of war. Thank you to all our Patreon supporters for making this.
Thank you for the videos. Epic history. Okay, hope that you enjoyed it. Once again, this was one of the biggest battles that Europe has seen, with the numbers, with the casualties, also with the artillery shots made. I think it was like 200,000 or something like that in those few days. But Napoleon starts to lose at the front, at the home. He's losing allies, as we saw. And although he will have some success in defending France, because the allies are trying, will now try to push to Paris, to the capital city. he's going to lose. But stay here, subscribe if you want to see more about Napoleonic Wars or other historical topics. And until the next time, see ya.